Last year, many of us at the Abbey read a compelling book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And it's a semi-autographical memoir of how and why people, especially people of color, are treated unfairly in the U.S. And Brian's book describes racial inequality in America in a very clear and unmistaken way, especially in the criminal justice system. So when an email came out last month about attending a one-day workshop on why race matters, I jumped at the chance. This workshop was sponsored by a group called Greater Spokane Progress, and so I signed up. GSP is a network of over 40 local organizations that try to drive progressive change by connecting, coordinating, and supporting diverse organizations. So they said that the purpose of the workshop was to develop some kind of new collective understanding and common language around institutional and structural racism, and to understand why addressing race actually matters. Using a very acclaimed PBS documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion, the workshop addressed several issues. How racial inequalities have been built into institutions and structures throughout our country, why it's important to use a racial equity lens in looking at our society today, and what we can do to advance racial equity in our organizations and community. And so the presenters singled out 4 things for us to recognize at the beginning: that we live in a highly racialized society, kind of obvious in this day and age. When we look at any measure of social indicators like income, education, health, criminal justice, etc., a racial fault line runs through all of them. There's not a single social indicator in which there is not a pretty obvious disparity based on race, including poverty. Usually when we think about race or racism in our society, we focus on individual racism or bigotry, individual actions. But instead, this workshop really tried to focus our attention on systemic racism, how systems foster this racial fault line of disparity based on race. And so I'll talk about that more in just a minute. So that's the first thing, that we live in a highly racialized society. Second recognition is that we're all part of the picture. White people usually view racism as something that happens to other people, like walking through an art museum studying a painting on a wall entitled Racism in the United States. But none of us are just looking at the picture, we're in the picture, aren't we? This is our country. The third recognition is that none of us asked for a highly racialized society. And so it's important to recognize that none of us is personally responsible for this, but all of us are responsible for the present and, to some extent, for the future that we're involved in. And then the fourth recognition that is, as we talk about racial equity, racism continues to play out in our country in some very obvious and not so obvious ways. And so I met a lot of nice people who are involved in organizations that are already pretty racially conscious and doing good work. We discussed our ideas about where racism comes from and our early experiences having to do with race. But the most powerful part of the workshop for me was watching these PBS documentaries, Race, the Power of an Illusion. They're about the creation and history of racism and how it continues to impact our country. And so I'd like to share with you some of the snapshots that have stayed with me from that documentary. Our Constitution says that all men are created equal. It's a very lofty and revolutionary idea at America's core. Yet that statement was written at a time when some in America were held in bondage, while others were being cheated out of their land simply because of their race, or the color of their skin, let's say, or their nationality. Our country has a long history of justifying unequal treatment on the basis of skin color and national origin by creating a story, the story of race. Keep in mind that slavery predated the idea of race. Throughout much of human history, societies have enslaved others as a result of a conquest of war, or sometimes out of debt, but not because of physical characteristics or a belief of natural inferiority. We may have a strong belief that there are fundamental differences between human beings of different races, but It's now a scientific fact that race is just an idea that evolved over time. Isn't that amazing? The history of race can be traced to show how it was intended to support certain political and especially economic goals of the country. Thomas Jefferson, one of America's founding fathers and the third U.S. president, had up to 225 slaves at the peak of his slave holding. And while he's credited for the line in the Constitution that says all men are created equal, he also wrote another book called Notes on the State of Virginia. This was in 1782. It was kind of a promotional sales pitch to the French who were interested in this colonial experiment that America was involved in. And although Notes on the State of Virginia was primarily about America, the mountains, the ports, the boundaries, the rivers, things like that, not about race at all. It included Jefferson's views about America's inhabitants. So people from Europe, people from Africa, and people who they found in America, American Indians. He said, "I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in terms of endowments of both body and mind." Jefferson's words seem to justify slavery at a time when some of the founding fathers were getting some pushback for espousing things like freedom, liberty, democracy, and at the same time maintaining a system of human bondage and slavery. Something's not quite right here. If all men are created equal, it would seem then that some enslaved people are not quite men. Otherwise, they would be equal. And thus they began being written out of the human family. Jefferson later said that we couldn't know why blacks were inferior until scientific research explains it to us. And of course, someone filled that gap. One of them that was mentioned was Dr. Samuel Morton. He, from his work with an impressive skull collection that he gathered from all around the world, he asserted that people could be divided into 5 different races, with distinct characteristics that correspond to their divinely determined hierarchy. Of course, Caucasians are at the top. They were most intelligent. Then Mongolians, which really is talking about Asians. Then Southeast Asians. Then Native Americans. And at the bottom were Ethiopians, or the black people. His ideas were quickly taken up by defenders of slavery. There's no question that human beings have differences in terms of our skin color, the texture of our hair, our eyes, the shape of our eyes. There are also differences in characteristics such as our intelligence or our athletic ability, maybe our music ability, and so on. We may assume that some of these differences are rooted in our biology or our genetic makeup. But is that enough to make race biologically real? There are no genetic markers that define race. There are no genetic markers that are exclusively found in one race that are not also shared with people in another race. Recently, when scientists set out to assemble the first complete human genome, they deliberately gathered samples from people who identified as members of different races. And in the year 2000, when the results were announced at the White House, at a ceremony at the White House, Craig Venter, a pioneer of DNA sequencing, confirmed that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. Studies of genetic diversity have allowed scientists to reconstruct a kind of family tree of human population, which has revealed a second deep truth, which is that genetic tells us that all non-Africans today are descended from a few thousand humans who left Africa maybe 60,000 years ago. We're all African Americans. In a very real sense, all people alive today are African, of African descent. So it's interesting that across the world today, skin color is highly variable. Much of the difference correlates with latitude more than anything. It's an evolutionary trait. Near the equator, lots of sunlight makes dark skin a useful shield against ultraviolet radiation. Whereas towards the poles, where the problem is too little sun, paler skin promotes the production of vitamin D. So there's a mutation that's most responsible for giving Europeans our lighter color. It's a single tweak in a gene known as SLC24A5, which consists of 20,000 base pairs, whatever that means. In one position of these 20,000 base pairs, where most sub-Saharan Africans have a G, Europeans have an A. That's what makes the color of our skin different. So there's a lot more to that story, of course, but this is a short BBC, so. Okay, another snapshot that I brought home with me is that this series documented how race justifies social inequalities as natural. As the idea of race evolved, white superiority became commonplace, common sense in America, actually. So it not only justified slavery in the founding of our country, it also justified the extermination of American Indians when the U.S. wanted their land, the exclusion of Asian immigrants from citizenship despite their amazing contribution to our country, and the taking of land from Mexicans. Racial practices were institutionalized within American government, laws, and society very early on. Indeed, a civil war was fought over slavery. Over 620,000 Americans died in that war. Although the war ended in 1861, racial segregation was continued to be enforced through Jim Crow laws in the previously Confederate states until 1965, 100 years later. All men are created equal, morphed into separate but equal, with racial segregation in all public facilities, modes of transportation, restrooms, drinking fountains, etc., at least in the South. Jim Crow laws institutionalized economic, education, and social disadvantage for African Americans living in the South, while in the North, segregation was enforced through private housing lease covenants, where blacks simply couldn't lease in certain areas of the cities. Bank lending practices and employment discrimination that disenfranchised or discriminated against African Americans. Between 1890 and 1910, former Confederate states passed new constitutions or amendments that disenfranchised most blacks and thousands of poor whites through a combination of poll tax, literacy and comprehension tests, residency, and record-keeping requirements. Their voting was suppressed in state and national elections, and they suffered from being made invisible in the political system. They couldn't influence the state legislatures, and their interests were overlooked. Schools and libraries for blacks were underfunded, if they existed at all, and the rising middle class, black middle class, all but disappeared at that time. Okay, so here's a third snapshot, and I'll wind it up. 2.5 million African Americans enlisted for the draft in World War II, so now we're into the 40s. After the war, they believed they had more than earned the right to be treated as full citizens because of their military service and their sacrifices. After the war, many large suburban housing developments were built in the U.S. for returning veterans and their new families. You can Google Levittown, Pennsylvania for more information. Where Venable Simke was born and bred. The GI Bill aimed to help World War II veterans adjust to civilian life by providing them with benefits, including low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans, and financial support. But African Americans did not benefit nearly as much as white Americans because the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. For example, in the New York and New Jersey suburbs alone, 67,000 mortgages were insured by the GI Bill, but fewer than 100 were taken by non-whites. Outrageous, huh? Probably not for lack of trying. African Americans were largely segregated in urban ghettos where rents were cheaper. They were subjugated to renting. Sometimes a black family was allowed to move into a white neighborhood while predatory, what would you call them, businessmen, created fear in the white owners of that neighborhood and offered to buy their houses at a reduced cost, at a loss, actually. And then they turned around and sold those same houses to blacks at a higher rate. Yeah, that was an inflated price. There were many other fraudulent lending practices that targeted white fear and African American insecurity at that time. Also in education, by 1946, only 1/5 of the 100,000 blacks who applied for educational benefits under that GI Bill were registered in colleges. Most colleges in the South at that time didn't admit blacks, and colleges accepting blacks were full to the brims and typically of poorer educational quality. So the educational and economic gap between white and black nationally widened under the effects of the GI Bill after World War II. So are you getting the picture of systemic racism in the United States? The fact is that financial advantages accumulate from one generation to the next, or not. A family passes on their house or family business to their children. But if families have been forced to rent all their life, they have very little equity to pass on, and the cycle of poverty persists. So these are just a few of the snapshots that really slapped me in the face in this day of looking at why race matters in America today. And so, again, the name of the PBS documentary is Race, the Power of an Illusion. There are some trailers on YouTube that are quite compelling, and I hope that you are as uncomfortable with the present situation in America as I am, and I hope that these little snapshots that I've shared today can fuel some interest in continuing to learn more and to contribute to racial equality and racial equity wherever you live.